How do you find the design workflow that's right for you? The one that when you start a project, you know that it is going to turn out great because you have a method that guarantees great results. What's up? This is MVA Joshua. In today's video, it's another off-the-cuff kind of impromptu one. After doing a kind of experimental speed run sort of project with my students, getting them to start thinking about noticing when things are feeling good, even if they're not necessarily sure of the results, but noticing like when stuff feels right. I think that is how you find a methodology or a workflow that works right for you. My apologies again, because this one, like yesterday's about career stuff, it was shot at the same time, so there's no face in the video, which I guess is great, because that means you can just put your headphones on and not have to actually look at the video. Thanks a lot for watching.
I was designing a CD package for someone. There was like a deck, then there was a PDF of more stuff, then I forgot that there was a PDF of more stuff. So we like picked something, then I remembered this other one and sent that over. That had 20 pages of versions on something. The project was done in maybe a month. I spent 24 hours on it over the course of that month. But if you were to look at the volume, like if you looked at the process, you would assume that it was much more than that, but I just work really, really fast. Like if I work for 20 minutes and don't feel like something happened, I just assume that I fucked it up somehow, like my head was in the wrong place, or maybe I was cheating and trying to do something. By kind of trying too hard, I messed myself up. So a couple things that I would say is, one, you'll adapt how you work and what's good to the framework that you put it inside of. So if you were just from here on out, be like, I am never, unless I'm forced to by other people, spending a single full 9 to 5 designing stuff. I'm always gonna work in 1 hour discrete chunks. Eventually, you'll rewrite how you work so that 1 hour chunks are totally fine and they work for you, or 15-minute chunks, as the case may be. So one of the things to think about is that, like, if it feels good, like if something about it feels right, embrace that. There's a good chance that what that's telling you is you're wired to work in a certain way. Like, I always really liked classes would start at 1 and then have to have work for critique at 4:30 or 5. And you just had to make something on the spot. Those were always my favorite things, and I didn't put it together for a really long time. Like, oh, I work really fast and I hate revisions. And like typically in that kind of time frame, you can only do one version. So the problem is on a real project, if you only do one version in 3 hours, but you're being paid as if it's a real project, because like for 3 hours, no one should give me $2,000, right? Like it's unreasonable demand. So it was figuring out like, oh, I do lots and lots of versions in really short bursts. That's what works for me. That wouldn't work for everyone, and it would be absolute torture for some people. But eventually I kind of pieced together, this is how I'm supposed to work. And if I look back on everything that felt right, kind of regardless of how it turned out, but that the working on it was really fun, it had that in common. These really short bursts where instead of revisions, it was like, make a few, just pick the best one, call it a day. Now that's a thing where I can go like, this is how I work. But at the same time, the more you do it, the more you become aware of like what you have decided is possible. Because when I first got out of school, someone would give me 2 weeks to do something, like my first actual job. Basically 80 hours to design like a half-page flyer, and I knew that it would be late because like I would fuck it up with all that time. What I should have done was like 2 versions every day leading up to that point, but instead I would try to like do the one version because that's how like the people before me worked. They were like perfectionists and precise. So that worked for them, but for me it was like an absolute nightmare. It would have been better if every project was due the following morning. So that's one thing to think about. It's just like, notice what works for you and then start to just dive into it, because what'll happen is that if it really works for you, each time it's going to be better and better than the time before. The other thing is, a lot of the times what you'll do is you have all this time and you work on one version. And if you believe that it needs to take a certain amount of time, when you have something work out right off the bat, you're not going to run with it because of the fact that you're not fully invested in it. So what ends up happening is, a lot of us, this is how I used to do it, the way you invest yourself in the work so that when it's done, you're like, yes, I stand behind that, is you tweak it to death over stuff that doesn't matter. The kerning, the mathematically proportional size relationships, spending an hour looking at Pantone colors. Like, all these perfectionist things are a way of, I think, a way of making yourself feel like I'm invested in this. What I've noticed is, like, did we look at Brian's film festival stuff in this class?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing he ended up doing was this happy accident. He was fucking around in Photoshop, basically. All of a sudden something showed up and he was like, that's the poster. If he had done that on day one, he would have thrown that away, because he would have been like, oh, this is cool, but, because he wasn't like invested in it. But prior to that one image popping up on his screen, he had this rich, deep process. Besides the research, there was a shitload of sketching and thinking through those sketches. He was so intimately knowledgeable about the thing. He was now the expert on both the content and what the design should be. It showed up and he was like, that's it. I think that the happy accident is really a lot more rare than people let on, because if you're not invested in it yet and you don't feel like you've earned the right to it, a lot of times the happy accident is kind of like, that's cool, but I don't know. Because it's like, it's just not there yet. It's kind of like you have to have some weight on your shoulders to be like, oh, that's the thing that's gonna save my life right now. One of the reasons I do a lot of versions in a short period of time is that keeps me from doing the tweaky stuff, and then I save the tweaky stuff for things that are approved. You know, somebody sees all the versions, then I go, okay, I gotta get serious about the color now. Before that, the Illustrator color swatches is fine. Doesn't matter that it's 186 or 187, it just needs to be fucking red. But then if the person's like, okay, this, it's like, okay, now let's be serious about the red. Like, now let's make sure the font sizes match. So if you start to get comfortable with working really fast, if you can keep your head on this kind of quantity aspect of it, it really helps to then have that investment to where you're working less on stuff than most people are, but you're confident in it because you're like, I've done my due diligence, I've done my research, and you get this added bonus, which is that, like, you do one of these exercises every day, you now have this like storehouse of stuff you can come back to later, like when you're in a jam or whatever, that you can be like, oh, wait a second, there was that weird thing I did in this, and then like you have like stuff that you can kind of reach into and pull from. It's hard to work really fast on one version. I think it's hard to get a high degree of confidence in it. Most people will feel like they cheated. Most people want to earn the thing, unless you do a project a day. If you do a project a day, then it'd be fine, because by the next day you've forgotten about the thing you did the day before. But I think that's why I see a lot of people, like, they'll say, oh, I have a concept, and then they get really weird and non-committal about it, because once they've executed it, it only took an hour and a half or whatever, and we're supposed to work for another 2 weeks. There was a lot of doubt in the process because it felt too easy. It felt like cheating almost. Just kind of two things to think about. One is the affinity you have for the process, and then two is that one way or another, you have to put a lot into the work so that you're confident at the correct time. You can either do that by massive amounts of sort of research and whatnot, or perfectionism, or a kind of quantity over quality approach, which is like, you know, if you give a shit, it's quantity and quality. It's just that like a lot of it is not going to be as polished as it could be. But I think there's these kind of legs to that creative process. If you start to embrace that, the happy accidents will become a lot more prevalent because there's no doubt. Like once you can kind of excise doubt from the creative process, all of a sudden the fuck ups that you encounter, like you bring in a file into InDesign too big, and you're like, wait a second, this is not what I intended at all, but this is cooler than what I was planning on doing. And you kind of go like, all right, cool, I'll quickly do this and I'll do the thing I was planning on doing. just in case it's good, but it's like it gives you that thing of your ego can kind of take a back seat. It's almost like it's confident that you're going to get somewhere, so it can kind of chill out a little bit. I mean, obviously that's not like facts or whatever. It's like my theory, but I know it works for me, and I see enough people when they're flailing. It's usually when all the eggs are in one basket and the time is way out of sync with it. One solid idea when you only have 6 hours, great. One solid idea that would take only 6 hours, but you have 47 hours to work on it, that's where it turns into this weird kind of disaster. But if all of a sudden the whole process is a kind of form of research, because instead of being like, okay, I sit down, I have an idea, I do the one thing, then it's done, you look at it as like this funnel. I try a bunch of stuff, pull out the things that work, then I try some stuff with them, I pull out what works, or I show it to the client or whatever. The idea being that like at the top, regardless of how you're working, you want a lot, whether it's a lot of research, or in a case of like a project like this, a lot of sketching and versions. One way or another, it's like you want to go from many to few. So you have those things, and then you have this other idea, which is that it should be in the form of this kind of giant triangle, and that these things lead right into each other. And then really you'd end up with like final, beautiful diamond. That's a diamond. Ting. That's beautiful.